The Old Testament figure of Joshua, and indeed the book of Joshua, are only mentioned twice in the New Testament, as far as I can tell. If anyone knows of more, please let me know. But as far as I know, they're only mentioned in the book of Acts in Stephen's speech and in the book of Hebrews when the author of the book of Hebrews is talking about the superiority of Jesus' rest as opposed to the rest given by Joshua entering the promised land. So it's a bit daunting to talk about the reception of Joshua in the New Testament. But the Gospel of Matthew in particular does talk about an issue which is high on the agenda of the book of Joshua, and that is the Canaanites. Uh, the Canaanites seem to be mentioned or alluded to three times in the book of Matthew. But first, let me just say a few words about the conquest of Canaan and the book of Joshua. The conquest of Canaan and its peoples is commanded in Deuteronomy 7, 1 to 2, a text which is, for Christian readers, one of the most difficult and troubling passages in Scripture. When the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are about to enter and occupy, and he clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations mightier and more numerous than you, and when the Lord your God gives them over to you, and you defeat them, then you must utterly destroy them. Make no covenant with them and show them no mercy. The narrative of the book of Judges recounts the partial fulfillment of this command from Deuteronomy, a command echoed in Joshua 1:6, be strong and courageous, for you shall put this people in possession of the land that I swore to your ancestors to give them. And in Joshua 3:10, Joshua said, by this you shall know that among you is the living God, who without fail will drive out from before you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites. So the book of Joshua is the narrative fulfillment of the command to conquer these peoples. So what does Matthew have to say about this? Matthew's gospel contains at least 2 and possibly 3 references to Jesus restricting his ministry to Israel. On the other hand, as is often noted, Matthew's numerous mentions of Gentiles hint that he wants the readers to understand that the time of an exclusive mission to Israel has limits and that Gentiles will soon be welcomed into the community of God's people. What's not noticed as often is that for Matthew, quite a number of the Gentiles that he alludes to are actually Canaanites. So, first text, Matthew 1, 1 to 16, the genealogy. Genealogy of Matthew opens with references to 4 women before he gets to Mary. 3 are certainly Gentiles, Tamar, Rahab, and Ruth, and 1 is either a Gentile or at least married to a Gentile. She is called the wife of Uriah. It's probable that 2 of these Gentile women are Canaanites. Rahab, obviously from Jericho, and Tamar. The narrator of Genesis 38 tells us that Judah's wife was a Canaanite and implies that Judah, while living in Canaan, also arranged the marriage between Tamar and his son, leaving the reader with the impression that Tamar was a Canaanite. Rahab is much more obvious. Bathsheba, in Matthew, left unnamed, but called the wife of Uriah, if she is a Hittite like her husband, also comes under the general category of those to be conquered, according to Joshua 3:10. Thus, we have the odd situation at the head of Matthew's gospel, where we find a genealogy in which foreigners, even Canaanites, the worst of foreigners, are held up as ancestors of the Messiah. No doubt the text is signaling an anticipation of the mission to the Gentiles, but it seems that Matthew is not only interested in Gentiles in the abstract, but even in Gentile enemies, Canaanites. By the way, the fact that Gentile enemies are in view from the beginning of the gospel may give a bit of an edge to Jesus' command to love your enemies in Matthew chapter 5. The second text I want to talk about comes near the end of the gospel, and that is Matthew 21, 12 to 14. The story of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem and disruption of the temple includes a detail unique in this gospel. In Mark, we hear only that Jesus inspected the temple and then retreated to Bethany for the night. The temple demonstration happens the next day. In Matthew, the action seems to continue on the same day as the entry. So Matthew 21, 12 to 14 say, Then Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who were selling and buying in the temple. He overturned the tables of the money changers, the seats of those who sold doves. He said to them, It is written, My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers. The blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he cured them. It's clear that in Matthew 21:14, the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he cured them, contains an allusion to the story of David's capture of Jerusalem, recounted in 2 Samuel chapter 5. Let me read just a bit of that story. And the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites. Remember, the Jebusites are the last nation mentioned in that list of nations in both Deuteronomy 7 and Joshua chapter 3. Against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, You will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off, thinking David cannot come in here. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. And David said on that day, Whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the blind and the lame, who are hated by David's soul. And David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David built the city all around him from Millo inward. And David became greater and greater, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. The Jebusites, of course, are among the 7 nations to be exterminated, according to Deuteronomy 7 and Joshua 3. The Jebusites who inhabited Jerusalem in David's time are confident that their defenses will hold, so much so that they mockingly predict an easy defeat, saying that even the blind and the lame would defeat David's army. Their mocking, however, is turned on its head as David defeats the Jebusites in miraculously simple fashion. But the story also reveals David to be lacking in mercy. Word mercy being important in Deuteronomy 7. Even after the defeat, David is said to hate the blind and the lame. David's hatred, according to 2 Samuel, leads to a prohibition of the lame and the blind from access to the house, that is, the temple. The story has an etiological character to it. The defeat of Jerusalem is presented here as the origin of the prohibition of anyone who is disabled from entering the temple. The blind and the lame are excluded. Their exclusion forever reminding Israel of the even more radical exclusion of the Canaanites. Reading Matthew 21:14 as an allusion to 2 Samuel 5 reveals a stark contrast between the David of 2 Samuel and the son of David in Matthew 21. The first David curses, the second brings healing. The first David defeats the Jebusites, seemingly the last Canaanites, and mocks them as blind and lame. In contrast to David, and contrary to the narrative of Joshua and the command of Deuteronomy, Jesus shows mercy to those who have been excluded. And the final text is the more obvious one, and that is the story of the Canaanite woman in Matthew chapter 15, 21 to 28. Jesus left that place and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Just then, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and started shouting, Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon. But he did not answer her at all, and his disciples came and urged him, saying, Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us. And he answered, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But she came and knelt before him, saying, Lord, help me. He answered, It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. She said, Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. Then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed instantly. This story differs from its Markan source in calling the woman in the story a Canaanite. Mark, of course, calls her a Syrophoenician. The redactional change is remarkable for several reasons. First, the word Canaanite is found nowhere else in the New Testament, making the woman in Matthew 15 the only person in the New Testament explicitly designated as such. Second, it seems likely that Matthew's use of this archaic term is a literary term for the stereotype it evokes. As Musa Dubé notes, Jerusalem and Canaan are not only place names, but also ideologically loaded geographical markers. Matthew's use of the term Canaanite to describe the woman in Matthew highlights that this woman and her daughter are the worst of outsiders, the quintessential enemies of Israel, the ones God had commanded Israel to exterminate because of their sins. The Canaanite woman, then, excuse me, is not merely a Gentile, but a representative of those peoples who are God's as well as Israel's enemies. The narrative setting places the story of Jesus and the Canaanite woman between two feedings in the wilderness, feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 14 and the 4,000 later in chapter 15. This context may be significant since it's often noted that the stories of Jesus' miraculous feedings carry overtones of the Exodus narrative. Just as God fed the recently emancipated Israelite slaves with manna in the desert, so Jesus feeds the multitude. Some have seen the story of Jesus walking on the water in Matthew 14 as a parallel to the parting of the Red Sea in the Exodus. This would make the healing of the daughter of the Canaanite woman then as possibly in parallel with the conquest of Canaan. The story of the Canaanite woman is followed closely by the feeding of the 4,000. Many have noticed that the first feeding story ends with 12 leftover baskets, which is an obvious Israel number. The number of baskets of leftovers from the second feeding, 7, needs a bit more attention. If it can be conceded that the number 12 is an Israel number, surely we should also expect 7 to be symbolic. The feeding of the 4,000 may be meant to be seen as a Gentile feeding. The location of the second feeding is Galilee. For Matthew, this is Galilee of the Gentiles, chapter 4:15. The 7 leftover baskets may imply that the feeding of the 4,000 Gentiles prefigures the future Gentile mission. In the Hebrew Bible, the number 7 appears in at least 2 contexts in which the theme of the nations is prominent. Genesis 10, the 70 nations, is the whole inhabited earth at that time. And then Deuteronomy 7, when it's specifically 10 Canaanite nations that are to be exterminated. Likewise, Joshua 3:10 lists 7 nations that must be driven out. And Stephen, in his sermon in Acts, in his speech in Acts, mentions 7 nations. Although the Hebrew Bible contains several different lists of nations slated for extermination and subjugation in the conquest, Deuteronomy 7 and Joshua 3 are explicit that the number of nations is 7. So the second feeding story of Matthew may be an allusion to the Canaanite conquest of 7 nations, but now the nations are being fed rather than exterminated. The 2 feeding miracle stories also mirror the story of the Canaanite woman in their attention to the subject of bread. The reader who reaches the story of this woman's encounter with Jesus is already aware that Jesus is able to produce ample amounts of bread. Just as God was able to sustain Israel in the wilderness by the miraculous provision of manna, and just as God would provide Israel with all that they would need in the promised land, so Jesus provides for the crowds. The woman in our story, however, is not interested in recapturing the lost wealth of her ancestral lands. She wants merely the crumbs of bread that fall from the table. This disinherited Canaanite begs for just a crumb, the healing of her demon-possessed daughter. The feeding of the 4,000 then has the quality of a promise of better things to come for Gentiles, even for Gentile enemies like Canaanites. Although the mission of Jesus is at present confined to the lost sheep of Israel, the time is coming when a new mission will send the disciples of Jesus to make disciples of all nations, all Gentiles. Another suggestive feature of the Matthean story is the wording of her plea. Have mercy on me, O Lord, O Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon. The mandate given to Israel was clear: to exterminate the Canaanites and show no mercy to them. That which Israel was expressly forbidden to extend to the 7 nations of Canaan is specifically requested by this Canaanite. Now, of course, a major difficulty for Christian readers of this text has always been that Jesus appears reluctant to extend mercy. What is more, he appears rather insulting in his response. First, he ignores her. Her persistence bothers the disciples, and they attempt to have Jesus relieve them of the bothersome woman. She comes to Jesus again, begging for help. Jesus not only refuses again, but intimates that she and her people are dogs. But the woman is not finished. Again, she comes back to Jesus, turning his insult back and acknowledging her status as a member of a conquered race and begging for crumbs. It's instructive to note once again the contrast with the Markan story. Mark's account has the woman beg only twice, and only in one of these instances are her words recorded. Glenna Jackson has suggested that Matthew's redaction is based on a rabbinic tradition concerning another Gentile woman, Ruth. This is from Ruth Rabbah 2:16. Turn back, my daughters, go your way. Rabbi Samuel ben Namani said, in the name of Rabbi Judah ben Hanina, 3 times it is written, turn back, corresponding to the 3 times that a would-be proselyte is repulsed. But if he persists after that, he is accepted. In other words, according to Jackson, the Matthean Jesus words are not so much purposely insulting as they are a test. Matthew purposely poses Jesus as ritually testing the Canaanite woman's desire to become a member of the community of faith. As a good rabbi, Jesus tests her before he concedes that she is sincere. Now, of course, this is a text from the 5th or 6th century, so Jackson may be wrong in this point, but it's interesting nonetheless. Let me conclude. What does this reading of the story of Matthew tell us about our reading of the story of Joshua from a New Testament perspective? Am I suggesting a Marcionite reading in which the bad God of the Old Testament is superseded by the good God of the New Testament? I hope not. Perhaps we are to see the story of Rahab at the beginning of Joshua and the story of Ruth following the book of Judges, at least in the canon of the Septuagint, as a clue to a fully canonical reading. That both of these women are found in Jesus' own genealogy is suggestive. Perhaps these 2 Gentile women reveal the true meaning of the text is fulfillment of the promise to Abraham that all nations would be blessed. Jesus is the one who comes to heal the blind and the lame in the temple, overturning David's condemnation and conquest of the Jebusites. Jesus has mercy on and heals the daughter of the Canaanite woman and provides food in the wilderness, possibly for Gentiles. To anticipate our session on how texts like Joshua and Judges should be formative, at the very least, we can say that a fully canonical reading of these texts would not have allowed the story of the conquest of the Canaanites to be used, for example, by the Boers in South Africa as a proof text for conquering the Zulus. Such a reading would not have provided a biblical justification for subduing of Aboriginal peoples in North America, and it should not allow the U.S. Department of War to use biblical texts as a justification for war on perceived enemies. Thank you.
My assignment was greeted with, I would say, some enthusiasm as Dr. DeVore suggested I avoid Origen, who I understand you studied last year, concerning reception. And so I thought, oh, yes, let's look at Joshua and Judges in the second century. That seems like a great idea. But as Grant discovered in the New Testament, there are not all that many references, even given an entire century of literature. And so I also had to be somewhat creative as I thought about questions of reception and intertextuality. So, in order to get that ball rolling, let me sort of take a moment to set the stage here. The second century really should have been very fertile ground for the Christians of that century to probe and discuss and to be challenged by these questions of war, of violence, of looking at the Old Testament, to which they relied on a great deal in the absence of a closed New Testament canon. So there was many reasons, and I want to highlight three just very quickly of again why that century should be fertile ground to discuss violence and suffering. First of all, because as we know, the second century was a time where there were several communities going through their own periods of violence and suffering. In the 120 years or so leading up to Irenaeus, who I'll look at a little bit later, we know that Christians in the empire at this time experienced several imperially mandated moments of persecution, from Nero to Domitian and Marcus Aurelius, all again in those years. And this never occurred to me before, so this was actually very helpful, these studies. Irenaeus himself, it is fascinating to me to realize that all three of his mentors that we know about were all martyred. First, Polycarp, of course. Justin, we assume that he sat under Justin Martyr in Rome. He certainly borrows from him and presumably traveled through Rome, so that's always been an assumption. And then thirdly, his predecessor, the bishop in Lyon, Pothinus, also martyr. So Irenaeus, writing as he is, as again we'll talk about, in the late third quarter, early fourth quarter of the second century, he knows all too well about the consequences and the fruit of suffering. And then, of course, also in the second century, the destruction of the temple wasn't very far in the past, and the impact that it had on the church in Jerusalem there. So my point being, number one, that these Christians in the second century, particularly Irenaeus, had every reason to be ruminating on these issues. So secondly, and related to that, it's not surprising that what we do see in their writings is a fairly significant emphasis on pacifism and on the rejection of violence, on the almost not only an inevitability of martyrdom, but as Ignatius was quite famous for in his letter to the Christians in Rome, he essentially ordered them to not intervene on his behalf with any political friends or connections they might have, but to let this play out, for he was very desirous to end his life, as did Christ. And so there was this not only an acceptance of the rejection of violence, but even the welcoming of it, at least in isolated incidents. Justin and Irenaeus both cite the Isaiah Micah passage motif of the swords turning into plowshares as a call to, again, reject violence. And so this is significant to them. It goes without saying that they are strangers and foreigners in this imperial land, and their call is to follow the example of Christ. They pointed to the non-violent church, or rather cheek-turning ways of their Lord, and that he was to be their guide in these things. So again, first reason why the ground was fertile to be thinking about issues of suffering was because they themselves were facing it in some significant ways. Second reason why you might think the second century would be an opportunity for the church to be thinking these things is because these questions and these topics were emerging at this point in history among the philosophers, historians, the intellectuals at exactly this time in the second century, the ethics of war. No, they're not speaking of human rights, and nobody's accusing each other of being woke at this point, I don't think. But they are beginning to probe some of these issues. For example, among the Stoics, Epictetus, who had been a former slave himself, starts to teach about the dignity of every person, of how every individual shares in the divine logos. Plutarch begins to question the traditional understanding of and the so-called glory of war and the ethics of conquest. Josephus, of course, famed Jewish historian, has some thoughts on war and the validity of it. And maybe particularly significant for the early Christian writers was the oracles of Sibyl, as they were called, were quite popular in some circles. And these, I won't get distracted by this, but these so-called oracles and prophecies were highly anti-Roman, and again had many sentiments against violence. Even Marcus Aurelius himself, involved as he was in the persecution of 177 that essentially brought Irenaeus to the bishopric, even he, though he was one engaged in campaigns, in his meditations as a philosopher, uh, expressed doubt. He never glorified his only campaigns and expressed the tension in a way that previous emperors did not, as they thought about, again, the ethics of this. So, again, point two, this is a century where critical reflection is beginning to occur on these matters. And third reason why we might expect the early church to develop a theology of conquest is because, and Grant alluded to this fellow earlier of Marcion and the Gnostics, is that there was an immediate threat theologically with Marcion himself, as he, as I'm sure we all know, is famous for his own grossly construed canon of only Paul and severely edited Luke that excised nearly everything Old Testament Jewish related. For he saw between loving Jesus and this God of Joshua and Judges and conquest, he saw a great incompatibility, an incompatibility with far too great a breach to be possibly reconciled. And so he cut it all out. And so for that reason alone, you'd think, okay, so the early church, they need to be thinking about this. Surely they are going to broach the subject. Unfortunately, despite all of this, we do not see a lot of meaningful engagement in second century early Christian texts. Now, why is that? We'll circle back at the end with some concluding remarks, but first of all, again, we must acknowledge that we don't have a lot of texts from the second century. If you take out Irenaeus and Justin, you would have a very small codex left of the writings, these so-called orthodox safe writings. There's simply not a lot to go on. We know and are told that Justin and Irenaeus themselves wrote a fair bit more than we have. But again, there's simply not a lot of extant material. Secondly, that which we do have is not necessarily and entirely helpful. So there's no Bible commentaries in this century, and possibly there's not even a single surviving sermon from an entire century, maybe one or two. But again, we don't have that. Most of the texts that we have fall into categories of being personal letters, highly specialized topics, apologetic, martyrdom accounts, or again, works attacking very specific heretics and their teachings. So again, perhaps it's not surprising we don't find what we're looking for, but these are some of the realities that we're dealing with. So I should spend some time, I suppose, highlighting what we have and trying to talk a little bit about Joshua or Judges in part. And so what I will do in my remaining 8 or 9 minutes here is look at a couple of texts from both Justin and Irenaeus and see what they do say, much as Grant did. We'll see what they do have to offer us. So first, Justin Martyr. I'm not going to spend much time introducing him. You can chat PGT that yourself, but you know he was a second century apologist from around 100 to 165, self-styled philosopher. So again, he's presumably reading some of these Stoics that are wrestling with some of these issues. We have his two apologies and the dialogue with Trypho, and he was based in Rome, where he may have had some sort of theological, philosophical school. And in the dialogue, fortunately, he mentions Joshua by name nearly 40 times. Now the dialogue is fairly lengthy, 140 some odd paragraph chapters, but he likes Joshua, so he mentions him many times. He does not, again, comment on texts so much, but he loves talking about Joshua, the man, as Moses' successor and as a general. And I want to share with you two texts that really illustrate what he is doing, both with Joshua and with the Canaanites at large and with the topic of conquest at large. So the first comes with dialogue chapter 90. And he says to Trypho, the Jew, when your people waged war with Amalek, and Joshua was the leader of the battle, Moses, as we know from the story, stretched out both hands and prayed to God for help. Now Hur and Aaron held up his hands all day, lest he should become tired and allow them to drop. For if Moses relaxed from that position of outstretched hands, which was a position of the figure of the cross, then in that moment, the people were defeated. In other words, Israel was losing. But as long as he remained in that position, Amalek was defeated. And the strong derived their strength from the cross. In truth, it was not because Moses prayed that his people were victorious, but because while the name of Yeshua, Jesus, Joshua, was at the battlefront, Moses formed the sign of the cross. And so Justin there says there's a double connection. You've got Yeshua on the ground and the cross on the hill. And Justin says that is very deliberate. So this is just hinting at one way Justin is dealing with these texts. The second, later in the dialogue, chapter 139, And concerning the punishment of Noah's son, the one who laughed at his father's nudity, it says, a curse was transmitted down to all the posterity of the son who laughed. It was foretold that the descendants of this son, Shem, would possess the possessions and dwellings of Canaan, and that these possessions, in turn, would pass from the Shemites to the descendants of Japheth, who would rob the Shemites as they had robbed the Canaanites. And as the one people, the Canaanites, were forced into the servitude of the other two, so Christ has come in his power from the Almighty Father, and calling all men to friendship, benediction, repentance, and community, which should take place in the same land of all the saints, of which he has pledged that there shall be an allotted portion for all the faithful, as has been shown before. Wherefore, men from every land, whether slave or free, who believe in Christ and recognize the truths of his words and of the prophets, when they fully realize that they will one day be united with him in that land to inherit imperishable blessings for all eternity. So I'm just going to pause that right there. These are two glimpses of what Justin does. And for the sake of time, we'll circle back to that, but I'm going to just dive right into Irenaeus to show what he does, and then we'll reflect a little bit about these texts. So again, Irenaeus, a generation after Justin, although he may have sat under him as an elder leader, he is the bishop in Lyon, southern Gaul, writing around the year 180 probably. And in the Against Heresies, book 4, chapter 26, paragraph 2, he has this to say. And I should say that generally Irenaeus is a pretty Irenic guy. And so this is some of the heat that he's bringing here, just to say. He says, as heretics bring strange fire, that is, strange doctrine, to God's altar, they will be burned by heavenly fire, as were Aaron's disobedient sons to their altar. Those, however, who rise up against the truth and exhort others against God's church remain in hell, swallowed up by a chasm in the earth, as those who were with Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. But those who rend and separate the unity of the church receive the same punishment as did Jeroboam. They will hear Daniel's prophetic words, you offspring of Canaan. Lust has perverted your heart, you who are grown old in evil days. Now your past sins have come out. The master of that servant will come and will cut him off. And I will leave it at that. So, what we have in these three texts from these two individuals is we see essentially two broad categories under which I suggest to you that most of their references to conquest, to Joshua, to Canaan, or anything similar to it, they generally fall into one of two categories of what these two individuals are doing with them. Why do they cite them? Well, number one, they cite them as indicating that the violence in the Old Testament is simply analogous and a precursor to the final judgment of sin itself. So again, number one, there is just the assumption that judgment which we see in the Old Testament, and judgment is how they understood conquest, the holy ones conquering the unholy ones, ergo, since led by God, this is the judgment of God, and it is parallel to the judgment that all will face at the end of days. And there didn't really seem to be a whole lot of question of that presupposition. It just is what it is. It is the judgment that is coming. So a lot of, and probably, well, at least half of, if not the majority of, any references fall into that category. Uncritical assumption of the validity of judgment. Second is those texts that are used as a way to leverage the text to pursue a Christocentric interpretation and to use typology or foreshadowing, prophecy or allegory or whatever else one might use to show how Christ is really at the center of this. So in these texts, we don't have any Christophanies, but Justin has several of them, of significant scenes in the Old Testament, which he sees Christ there. But in the text that we did read, we saw that, well, you know what's interesting about the conquest of the Amalekites? What's really interesting is not the ethics of it, but how Jesus was actually present through the cross and his name. It was in his name, and that's interesting. And that's the kind of interest that they have in the second century, strengthening their arguments, attacking heretics, and putting Christ at the center. I'm out of time, so I'll pause it there, and we can discuss further implications and whatnot with your questions. So I'll leave it at that.
All right. Thank you to both of you, Don and Grant. Those are very stimulating thoughts that you've given us. If you do have a question, we'll let you queue yourselves up, and Jim will be moderating that. While you're getting in the queue, let me just start us off maybe with a question back to Don and just ask you maybe to expand the horizon to a little bit later than what you've treated. And I'm curious, would you say that it is the um, later availability of political power to the church as time goes on that then creates a context in which we have use of Joshua and Judges for violence more ahead of the final judgment?
Right. Yes, that certainly changes the dynamic entirely. I mean, most famously with Augustine, and not only that imperial powers are connected to the church, but with Augustine specifically as a political figure in his own right, dealing with schismatics, and now dealing with the tension of what is okay for me as a leader to justify in view of having to rebuke and ideally extinguish uh, heretical schism. And so now you really have them being forced to think about it. So yes, totally different context, which predictably uh, brings those issues more to the front.
So when I teach Joshua in particular and introduce the idea in Deuteronomy 7 that God is telling his people to go in and kill and get rid of um, large portions of the Canaanite population. Um, I I really stress that the key goal, and it's in the context of Deuteronomy 7 and Joshua, is that they need to get rid of the idolatry, and that is it's not the people themselves that are inherently the problem, but it is their idolatry. And so it does obviously involve killing people. But of course, the hyperbole of Joshua, kill everything that breathes, that is hyperbole common to the genre of the time. So nobody would have interpreted that in the time literalistically. So is this maybe the thread that's picked up most consciously in the New Testament and the early church, that this way of God enacting judgment really is for sin, really is for idolatry. It's not about ethnic cleansing. And that's really the dominant thread that gets picked up.
Well, yeah, there's a lot in Joshua about idolatry, obviously, and there's a lot in the New Testament about idolatry, but the method of handling it seems to be quite different. Uh, Trying to think of ways in which New Testament authors uh, condemn idolatry, and none of them seem to involve putting to death the idolater. Uh, there's this unusual note about someone who's been in sin, being excluded from the community and handed over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, but very few people think that actually is about physical punishment. Um, so yeah, there seems to be a huge shift, and the shift seems to take place at the cross. Jesus is the one who takes the punishment of the world on himself. And so there is no sense in which Christians should be imposing the death sentence on anyone else. We're still left with God commanding people to kill other people. Um, not easy.
Yeah, and in the second century, at least, you know, although even Irenaeus was prone to some foray into allegory and numerology and some other things, for the most part, he's taking things pretty literal. And perhaps in connection to the fact of how, especially him personally, how keenly he felt, violence against his communities. I mean, this has been the most helpful thing for me, is this realization of what I mentioned earlier about his mentors. And, he must have felt like everywhere he went, he would leave and his beloved teacher was killed. And because he had in Lyon, he had been sent to Rome at which when the persecution had happened. So he missed all of it. And when he returned, his community had suffered through that in 177. So he's, whether it's because of that or not, there is a strong dualistic view of the world in many respects. There's us and there's them. And so, yes, there is some mention of idolatry, but there's also a pretty narrow view of judgment, and not narrow, but the just the plain understanding that, yeah, this is going to be judged and it's going to be brutal. And so, I mean, again, there's just not the evidence of him, thinking about it as you have in terms of separating the sinner and the sin.
I've been reading some in the prophets, trying to have that link between Pentateuch and New Testament. And it has stuck out to me again and again. For example, Isaiah 45, 3, where God himself is speaking about all of the judgment that he'll do. I will do this so you may know that I am the Lord, the God of Israel, the one who calls you by name. Ezekiel, again, about all of the plagues that he will send. For then they will know that I am the sovereign Lord. That's Ezekiel 28:24. And then Ezekiel 35, I will demolish your cities, make you desolate. Then you will know that I am the Lord. So there's this divine perhaps in the ancient Near East mindset of the god of the region being the winner, the most sovereign one is the one who wins those battles in the war. I'm just wondering if either of you, Don or Grant, is there a link that continues into Jesus is the ultimate supreme Lord because he defeats all of the enemies, all of the darkness? Is there a thread in Jesus proving his sovereignty? He is the ultimate Lord because he has destroyed all of the enemies, ultimately death itself. Are you seeing the motif that I'm trying to track through?
Yeah, maybe one way of getting to that is especially in the Gospel of Mark, I think the battle between Jesus and the forces of darkness, um, where but ultimately Jesus defeats the forces of darkness by freeing people who are captive to them and by taking the forces of darkness on himself
Mhm.
on the cross. So yes, Jesus is the ultimate sovereign Lord, but the methods are so completely different from what we expect.
Yeah, and with Irenaeus, I mean, especially you see not only his popular thinking about Christus Victor and atonement as victory over darkness and sin and everything else, and the other unique thing about the second century, of course, is unlike just 100 years earlier, and you now are talking with Justin and Irenaeus of Greek minds, talking almost exclusively to fellow Greeks who are these persecuted aliens in the empire. And so it wasn't as in the New Testament where they're still in their Jewish context and they have their community. Now Irenaeus is again very much, they live under I was going to say the whore of Babylon. I should think of something other than that, but they're very much in this end time dark realm of the Lord of darkness is in control in many respects, but with the firm and unwavering conviction that yes, Christ is ultimately the conqueror, and it is only a matter of time when ultimate victory will be revealed.
Yes, thank you. It was the idea that the whole concept of God is victor is maybe a shadow in the Old Testament and the reality in the New. Anyway, thank you for helping me think about that.
Okay, I'm sorry. So I have a question for information that maybe could take just a minute to answer, but a more substantial question to follow it. I know that in the Jewish rabbinic tradition later on, they deal with the question of the eradication of the Canaanites by the argument that the seven nations are now intermarried with all other nations. So it's impossible to discern who is a Canaanite. Therefore, you can't carry out that law. Of course, the real reason is that they no longer have power. Jews have no
Right.
power. They're on the
Yeah.
margins of anything, so they don't need to do that. I wonder if there was any such discussion in the Jewish tradition in the second century of the question of violence against Canaan. Do you know about that?
I think that's to you, Don.
Yeah.
Oh, I was hoping it wasn't. Honestly, you know what? This is all quite new to me, so I've started down the path and have not yet discovered that.
Okay, I will look that up myself. My more substantive question is this. I've been dealing with a lot of interaction over the last decade with Jewish scholars, trying to read the same text together. I mean, it's the same and it's not the same. Tanakh is not quite the same as Old Testament. And I am clearly not in the tradition of replacement theology, but of fulfillment theology. Nevertheless, I have been very open in talking to some of my Jewish friends to say fulfillment theology is also a form of supersessionism, not towards contemporary Judaism, but to the Judaisms of the first century, just as the rabbinic tradition is also a form of supersessionism to the various second century traditions of Judaism, just as the Qumran community is a form of supersessionism. how do I talk about this question using, for example, I've seen some of the same insights that Grant saw in Matthew concerning the Canaanites, and I've talked about that before, even in an IBR session. How do I talk about this without being anti-Jewish?
Yeah.
You know, having a reasonable discussion with my Jewish peers and friends. How do I talk about that? Do you have any insight?
This is such a huge question, Richard, and it's not just how do I talk to my Jewish friends, but how do I talk to my Christian friends
Yeah.
who are assuming that these laws still apply somehow to us, that our enemies need to be exterminated. Um, uh, I think your idea of uh, what supersessionism is as kind of a rolling kind of supersessionism, that anyone who has any idea that is different from an idea that came before is trying to supersede in some way. So we can't avoid some form of supersessionism, even when we talk about fulfillment. Um, I think the first way we do it is by confessing ignorance, that we don't have all the answers to all these questions. And the second way is to try and find out what the key issue for us is. And the key issue, I think, for me is where the place of violence finds its fulfillment. Where does violence finally end? And again, I the Book of Revelation has kind of come up tangentially today. I think one of the things about the Book of Revelation that is interesting to me is that when John is told about the Lion of the tribe of Judah, what he turns to find is the Lamb. So I think unless we see Jesus as the Lamb of God who takes the violence of the world on himself, we have no other center to turn to. Does that help at all?
It helps me. Whether it's going to help
Yeah,
how I
yeah,
communicate that is another question. But thank you very much, Grant.
yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
And the only thing I would add to that is, and I don't know that the second century writers would necessarily have said this, but we can, in some respects, say, listen, today, just as in 1800 years ago, there is a point at which we just don't really know how best to deal with these difficult texts. There are difficult questions here that we don't understand. But at the end of the day, you could attempt to show them Justin's purported dialogue with the purported Jewish trifo. Whether that's very helpful, I'm not sure. But the point is that for both him and Irenaeus, they didn't say, I don't understand it, but what they did do is say, listen, all we know for certain is what we see in Christ. And so they tried to see him visibly and point out every opportunity. And so again, that's not necessarily going to be helpful, but that's the perspective that they had. It's what they wanted to talk about. It's what they chose to fixate on. And for them, it became the key to absorb the rest of it.
Richard, it reminds me of another text, another difficult text, which is the Book of Esther, and how a friend of mine was in Jerusalem during Purim one time and went to a feast, a Purim feast, where, of course, the Book of Esther is not only read but enacted, and of course, the bad guy, and this was a while ago, the bad guy was Yasser Arafat at that point. And lemons were thrown at him, and in the context of the liturgy. So I think I would want to ask my Jewish friends how they deal with that kind of reading of a text. Is that a normative reading for them? or is there some other way that they can deal with the violence of the text?
Well, I think the acting out ritually with humor, which is standard
Yes, sure.
ritualism, is a way
Yep.
to deal with that. It's a way to
Yep.
defang the text.
Yep. Yeah, it could be.
Let me say, apropos of the last conversation, of course, our inability to resolve a difficulty does not imply that the difficulty is insuperable. But I also wanted to ask about this reference to Simon the Zealot in both the
Yep.
identification of the 12 in Mark and Matthew as Simon ho Cananias.
Yeah.
And I mean, we look at that and think, oh, well, that's Aramaic for zealot. But I don't think many early Christian readers would have looked at it in that way.
You think
Does
they would have
anyone,
taken it as a pun?
I think you think they would have taken it as a
Well,
pun?
I'm wondering if you think that. I mean, it means zealot, but
Right. I take it as a pun.
yeah.
But especially when you're moving into the second century and from people who've never been around others who speak Aramaic, not much history of interaction with Jewish believers, how would they have dealt with that text?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because whatever zealot means, whether there was a zealot movement exactly in the time of Jesus or whether that
Right.
only grew up later, whatever zealot means, it's the opposite of a Canaanite.
Right.
So it's a bit of an odd text, isn't it? So, I did have a footnote to that, but it could be that certainly the King James Version picks it up and makes him a Canaanite.
A Canaanite, right.
Yeah. Yeah. But modern translations have not done that. He's simply a zealot, whatever that means. So yeah, I'm not, if it is a pun, it's a fascinating one. And maybe it's a kind of thing that Jesus is alluding to when he's going into the temple, says that you have made this temple a den of lace tie, right? Insurrectionists.
Yes, yes.
That could be. So it's interesting.